Greetings, everyone. I am very excited today to be in conversation with Ray Grasse, who is an internationally known astrologer. He's also a writer, photographer, and musician. He's been associate editor for the Mountain Astrologers magazine since 1998 and has lectured extensively on the topics of astrology, synchronicity, and mythology. He has an active astrological practice and is the author of 10 books, including Signs of the Times, When the Stars Align, StarGates, and many others. And I'm very excited to be in conversation with you today, Ray.
Me too. Thank you.
We have so much to talk about, so this will probably be the first of more conversations, but I would love to start today talking about this amazing new information that's come out about the Giza Plateau and the Khafre Pyramid in particular. But before we get to that exciting news, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your own background in Egypt, because you've been critical in terms of some of your interactions with researchers there and some of the discoveries, like the Tomb of Osiris. So share some about that.
Yeah, I'll try to condense it down as succinctly as possible. Like a lot of people, I've been fascinated by ancient Egypt since I was a kid. But it was when I read John Anthony West's book, Serpent in the Sky, in the 80s that really fired my imagination. And then when I wound up working for the Theosophical Society, I worked there in Wheaton, Illinois, um, from 1989 to 1999, though I still keep in touch with the people there. I was one of my jobs there was working in acquisitions and searching for new manuscripts, looking for old ones that had gone out of print. And I discovered that John West's book, I had met him when I was at his end. That's too far afield. I met him before in Woodstock, New York, back in '86, I think it was. And so when I found out that Serpent in the Sky was out of print, I contacted John and asked him if he was interested in getting the book back in print again, and he was excited about it. So we got that back in print. It came out in 1993, the same time, coincidentally, synchronistically, as his TV show, Mystery of the Sphinx, NBC, hosted by Charlton Heston, which
Mm.
had a huge, it beat in the ratings, it beat Dances with Wolves, the premiere on network TV. It was astonishing. And he won 2 Emmys as a result of it, him and his partner, Boris Said. To make a long story short, I went to Egypt with him in '94 with a tour group. And then I got to know very well his associates, Boris Said and Robert Schoch, and wound up in '97. Robert Schoch and Dr. J.J. Hertog were talking about this mysterious chamber down deep in the Giza Plateau and invited me to come along. And I went in February of '97, right on a Jupiter, literally on the night of a Jupiter conjunct Uranus in Aquarius. Big lineup of planets in Aquarius. Same week, I think, as Dolly the sheep being cloned and all sorts of stuff. And several weeks before the Phoenix Lights, by the way. So I went over there and took part. I've written about this. It's on the dailygrail.com website. Look under Tomb of Osiris, Ray Grasse. But it's
Yeah, I'll
also
put the
in my
link
book.
below.
What's that?
I'll put the link below.
Yeah. And it's also, it's a more extended discussion of it in my book, The Sky Stretched Out Before Me, how with ground penetrating censoring devices, Thomas Dobecki, we found something underneath. They found something underneath the dirt at the bottom of that shaft in the so-called Tomb of Osiris. And we literally, with our fingers, crawled away when the person that was sent there to watch us very carefully went up for a pee break. got on the ground and we clawed the mud away from the sarcophagus lid, and the photograph of that is on that in that article and in that book. And when Zahi Hawass found out about it, he came right in and more or less kicked us out, more or less. And then a year later, it was on Fox. It's a Maury Povich hosted show about this unveiling of this thing because he went in to excavate it out. And it's since become a big topic of conversation. It's since the water tables come up and now it's kind of flooded, whereas in those days it was only water in the moat. And so anyway, that's kind of the key elements of it. And I've kept in touch with these people. Both John and Boris have died. JJ is still out there and still doing talks. And I've kept in touch with other people that are doing research over there and keeping on top of that. And the most recent developments, there's two major developments that have occurred. One is that Trevor Grassi, spelled with an I at the end, not with an E at the end, and Richard Gabriel and William Brown, those three have been heavily involved in researching caves under the Giza Plateau. There's an elaborate cave network, very rough. It's not, polished and carved out, not where they went because some of it's blocked off and they couldn't get closer to the pyramids. However, the big news is about a week ago, and we're doing this. What's the date today? Recording this on March 21st.
20th.
20th. It's a week ago. This Italian team, headed by Malanga and Biondi and a few others, they were using satellite radar to investigate what's below the Giza Plateau. This is the sort of technology that's used to kind of detect lava flows under the ground and things like that. So it does work. I'm frankly not sure how detailed and granulated they can get with that technology, but they claim they can get very specific and detailed with it. And what they came up with, that they released the data this last week, is absolutely extraordinary if it really bears out. And that's where I'm trying to remain a little bit skeptical until I see more proof. But the evidence is astonishing in terms of showing that beneath the middle pyramid, not the Great Pyramid, but the middle pyramid, Khafra, there are these tubular structures, shafts that go down with winding, it appears to be maybe pathways, maybe processional pathways, at the bottom of which are these chambers, who knows what's in them. And this goes down over 1,000 feet. In other words, it goes down further than the pyramids go up into the sky. This is, an astonishing sort of thing.
Like 2 kilometers down, isn't it?
Something like that, yeah. And if this bears out, it may be the most important archaeological discovery of all time. But I'm waiting to see more before I kind of declare that's what it is. People are already jumping on this as though it's proven. And I think to these Italians, it may well be because they know the technology better than I do. But it's a remarkable development, and if they can actually go down and see what's there, I don't think if Zahi Hawass agrees to this, because this was all done without any permission by the officials, because it was all they didn't need permission to
Right.
put the satellite radar down onto the Giza Plateau. Now, everybody's waiting with bated breath to see what Zahi says, because he tends to, well, I'm not going to get into that. But if he agrees to allow further investigation of this, and they do find that there are indeed these massive tubular shafts going down and that there is something at the bottom, I hope that happens in our lifetime. Things move very slow. It's the glacial in Egypt when it comes to archaeology. But it's a big development. Even if it's not exactly as these depictions, they've hired an artist to do computer recreations of what they think they're seeing with the radar scans. But the radar scans are very fuzzy, and that's why I kind of wonder to myself, how much detail can you get from those things like that? and to the point where they claim to see these spiraling pathways going down around the circular tubular shaft. So anyway, that's kind of the big news, and it's really broken on the internet, so that's the long and the short of that.
Well, and my understanding is the researchers haven't even put out the full information yet
Right.
and plan to do some kind of 4 hour presentation
Yes.
fairly soon to go into it
Yeah.
more in depth. But it really is an extraordinary find. And there's some speculation, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, that it could be the Lost Hall of Records.
Yeah, and that's something I've been involved with. And we went down into the Osiris shaft in 97. The secret hope, I mean, that people were talking amongst themselves was that this would lead to the Hall of Records. And Boris, for example, he was so gung-ho about this that I was almost thinking he was going to take a sledgehammer to the wall to try to, break through and find something. And they seriously at one point thought that maybe they were onto something with that. And my friend Barbara Keller, who just died a few weeks ago, sadly, she was involved with research. There was an archaeologist. He's now pretty much forgotten, but he was a colleague of Flinders Petrie. His name was Clarence Fisher, and he was well known in his day. And he was on to things. He died a mysterious death in 41, but he was on to things, and his papers disappeared afterwards. But he claimed to have been on the trail of what sounds, for all intents and purposes, to be like a Hall of Records type thing. And I forget the name of the pharaoh that he connected it to. And other archaeologists, Egyptologists, were searching in the same general area as he said this was. And so there are various theories about the Hall of Records and where it might exist and what it consists of, because, would it be papyri? Would it be engravings on stone? Would it be crystal tablets like some people think? Who knows? Um, I don't know what to think about it, but if, Casey, for example, felt that that these records probably existed, well, in several places, but one of them would be under the paw of the Sphinx.
Right.
And there's a lot of controversy about what does or doesn't exist under that area there. That's part of the work that William Brown and Trevor Grossi are involved with. I don't think the Italian team, they haven't released anything about further down the plateau like that, to my knowledge, and or maybe it hasn't been translated yet. But if there are indeed these hidden chambers under the pyramids, you can bet there's it may not be a hall of records, but there is something of vast importance, even if they're empty, and we just have these massive constructions that were done in ancient times. Were they done in dynastic times? Were they done prior? Like they're looking at these pottery vessels. They're not pottery, but these stone vessels that have been found in the thousands that seem to be of such precision. Chris Dunn is involved with this. Various people are involved with this. This has even been on Joe Rogan talking about this. How did they create these vessels with such extraordinary precision done in very hard stone like granite? And these were found in a lot of these were found in pre-dynastic burials. Who the hell did these things? You
Well,
know?
and exactly. And I think that's some of what's so important about this new discovery, because Robert Schoch was the one who really explored the patterns of erosion,
Yeah.
water erosion on the Sphinx, and speculated that it goes back 12,000 years and isn't in the dynastic period. And so I think there's been a lot of speculation about the age of the Great Pyramid in particular. But from my perspective, this would really indicate that the construction of the pyramids is much more ancient than we in traditional Egyptology believe they are, and that it's coming from a very advanced civilization.
Yeah, this is a bottomless topic. I mean, we could go for hours and hours about this. The pyramid, they can date certain things, like they found some wood inside the pyramid and all this, and then they some of the dating of the pyramid pushes it back only 300 years before the conventional dating, and other people like John West felt it was much, much older. Schock was a little more conservative. He felt it was several thousand years older than conventional estimates, but John West was, somewhat more, liberal about it, thinking it was maybe. Actually, the very first time I met John was in I think January of '86 at the Woodstock Public Library when he was doing a presentation. It was my last night at the Zen monastery there in Woodstock, near Woodstock, Mount Tremper. And I asked him, do you think that the Sphinx goes back like 12,000 years because of the age of Leo symbolism? And that's another topic we can get into.
Yes, absolutely.
But he said, well, it could be, but it could also be the previous age of Leo, 36,000 years ago.
Wow.
So he said, we just don't know. And my question, again, trying to play devil's advocate here is, the constellation of Leo wasn't really identified as a lion until fairly recent in history, the Babylonians, I think. So were the constellations understood the way we understand them now, 12,000, 36,000 years ago? And so there's a whole series of questions that come up around this. But I think there's no doubt that whether the Sphinx is older, well, I think the Sphinx is definitely older, whether the pyramids are older, there are these very mysterious things in ancient Egypt, such as those stone vases, such as constructions like the Osirian near the Temple of Seti,
Yes.
such as I think it's the Valley Temple or the Sphinx Temple, I forget which one. Uh, their construction is different from more modern or relatively modern temples. And so, and how the more I look into the Osirian, the more I'm flabbergasted at the complexity of how that was made and the hydrodynamic, the water, how they managed to work with the water the way they did, and the engineering involved with putting these casings down 50 feet, 100 feet, whatever it is. There's so many mysteries around ancient Egypt that um, I can't help but believe it extends back. The civilization and some of those monuments extend back way beyond what we think. And those vases, those stone vases, which is getting a lot more attention this last year or two because of various people like Ben at Uncharted X and all these, and Chris Dunn and all that. So
Because the technology of some of these things is so beyond what we can actually imagine doing today. So
yeah,
it really does speak to the probability of these very advanced civilizations much further in the past and perhaps before the last cataclysmic crisis 12,000 years ago.
it
Um,
could be. Yeah, there's so many question marks around this.
and the Assyrian temple is fascinating in that do you think that it was built in alignment with Deneb, the star in Cygnus, and how that may also speak to its timing in the processional cycle?
That I don't know. I've heard that, but I don't know, and I don't know how much credence to put in Cygnus. I know that's Andrew Collins', thing.
Right.
I mean, there's so much that is really isn't nailed down. It's an open question, and the Temple of Seti. There's so many things here. It's like the Osirian. It for that to have been carved out. I don't know how to explain this simply, but the Temple of Seti, which is before the Osirian, it's as though that it looks as though the Osirian must have been built predated the
Yeah,
Temple of Seti,
because it's
and
so much lower.
so much lower, and it doesn't make sense that it would have been carved out the way it was while the temple was there, the Temple of Seti. So it probably was buried, and they didn't even know it was there, and then they discovered as they moved the temple back, and then had to make it go left. So many question marks, and yeah, it's an endlessly fascinating topic.
Well, and one of the interests that you and I have in common is really looking at these larger cycles and the processional cycle in particular, and how this relates to shifts in our consciousness, shifts in technology, shifts in our cosmologies. And it's interesting to me, if you think about in the processional cycle, we have these really profound times of change, particularly every 12,000 years at the midpoint and the ending and beginning of a new cycle where we are now. It's interesting to me that some of these ancient sites, like Göbekli Tepe, may be aligned with the star Deneb, the Osirian temple, maybe. It almost feels like this ancient advanced civilization was leaving us messages in stone to try to potentially support us in waking up and being more conscious of the meaning of these larger cycles, to be participating in this profound shift that we're in now.
Yeah, and the whole thing you mentioned that 12,000 years ago, in Signs of the Times, I suggested that the fact that we're moving into the Aquarian Age by resonance is triggering the opposite age, which is Leo. And so now I think that may explain part of the reason why there's such a fascination, not only with that era, but with lion symbolism and the Sphinx. I think the Sphinx really could be a very profound symbol for the coming age. And also the fact different people interpret the Sphinx differently. But if you really break it down, it's a human head on a lion's body, which is Aquarius is the human, and the lion is the lion's body. I mean, the Leo is the lion's body. So, in a sense, the Sphinx embodies that juxtaposition of those two ages, with the human head being in the ascendancy, so to speak. That's the primary factor. Now, I know different people read the Sphinx differently. Like I said, some people bring in Virgo and all this. But if you really look at the basics, it's human lion.
That is brilliant, Ray. I have never heard that before, but that actually makes so much sense because
Which
it's unifying the opposites, the polarities, and bringing it into wholeness.
which is different, by the way, from the Sphinx, the Tetramorph, which you see images in some of the classical sources, including the biblical, like Ezekiel and all this, of the creature with four different features. That's called a tetramorph, the fourfold form, which is a little different from the Egyptian Sphinx. In other words, you've got the head of a person, I believe it is the wings of, like, of the eagle, which is the higher level of Scorpio, the body of a lion, and the tail of a bull. So that's the that has a whole esoteric symbolism in itself, which I get into in a couple of the books. But the Sphinx to me has that human lion juxtaposition, and it's an absolutely. I think there's a reason why we're drawn to that symbolism to right now. And that famous poem by Yeats, the slouching towards Bethlehem and the Sphinx and all this. He was into astrology. There's a lot. This goes in a lot of directions.
Well, we could talk for hours about Egypt, but this would be a good segue into talking about the age of Aquarius
Yeah,
and what it means that we're in that profound shift right now.
yeah.
And, you know, you've talked a lot in your writing about the different ways this might manifest as we're transitioning into the age of Aquarius. And say a little bit about your take on this transition time that we're in and how we can work with these energies consciously to be moving into the higher consciousness of the age of Aquarius.
Yeah. First of all, we're moving from an age of water, Pisces, into an age of air. That's probably the most basic way to breaking it down, which is the Piscean age was an age of faith, of religion, uh, of great mystical achievements like Dogen, the Zen figure, and Meister Eckhart and what's not Hildegard of Bingen.
Mm-hmm.
And on the negative side, it was a horrible time of religious persecution and self-flagellation and a certain negativity. Every age has its good and its bad, and we're moving into the age of Aquarius, which is no different in that respect. And so it's an age of the mind. It's an age of we're moving we're kind of like we're putting not we're not eliminating religion. It's moving into more freedom of religion. You're not going to be forced to believe a certain thing like the Crusaders coming through and cutting off heads and all this. It's more so an age of intellectual advancement, which was already started. The average school child has more awareness of the world now in terms of the fact that there is a world than anyone did back 1,000 years ago, as far as that there are other countries and other governments, and there's, knowledge of the solar system and things that we take for granted that the average person has, even without a scholarship or a PhD, is astonishing where it's already come. And now that's going into hyperdrive with AI and with information overload, information superhighway and all that. And the interesting thing about Aquarius, there are three earth signs, three water signs, three fire signs, and three air signs. And each one expands out. So, for example, Gemini is the first air sign, which is like it's everyday mind, you might say. It's like, what's three plus two? It's five. Well, that's working the everyday mind. Then you've got Libra, which is interactional mind. That's like the teacher standing before a class or someone on stage as a performer, um, or that sort of kind of how you interact with others. And then you've got Aquarius, which is collective mind. It's how many minds work in concert. Now, again, that can be a good or a bad thing. That can be like the Borg, in Star Trek with the
Right.
hive mind, or it can be like I call the potential, the real, I think, creative potential of Aquarius is symbolized by the jazz band in the sense of now compare a jazz band like Louis Armstrong's ensemble to an orchestra where you have a conductor up there that is telling everyone pretty much what to do, and they're all playing pre-assigned parts. They're not improvising. Whereas in a jazz band, each person is allowed to contribute their own individual creativity to the whole. That is the essence of Aquarius at its highest. It's also the essence of democracy at its highest. It's also the essence of the internet at its highest, at its highest. And so the age of Aquarius is an era in which the pooled energies and thought forms of millions of people is giving rise to, I mean, science is really an Aquarian
Mm,
undertaking because science is not about one person's opinion on anything. It's about comparing ideas and sharing and subjecting them to verification and empiricism and all this. And so science is it good or bad? It depends on how reductionistic it gets. It depends on how materialistic and mechanistic it gets and technology and all this. But in general, we're moving from an age of religion to an age of science, an age of secular kind of information, not atheism, not necessarily. You have that choice if you want to. But so, for example, AI embodies, I think, the best and the worst of the age of Aquarius. Have you ever seen the movie Metropolis, the 1926 or 27 film by Fritz Lang? It's a German film,
mm,
silent. It's considered not, it wasn't successful at the time, but it was an extraordinary, groundbreaking film in terms of special effects, and it's set in the future, like 2026, which is very
oh,
interesting.
interesting.
And it shows these extraordinary class divisions between the workers that are slaving away underground, and then you've got the elite that are kind of drinking and having fun and frolicking. But it was very prophetic in another sense. There's something in the movie, which you can find on YouTube, I believe. It's pretty long, and there's a reconstructed version. It In the movie, this mad scientist creates a robot, artificial intelligence in
Mm,
our terms, that they use. They confer these beautiful female features on the robot, and they use it to manipulate the masses, the workers. And I think that's really uncanny considering they set this story into our time right now, the
right.
mid 2020s. And it shows the potential problems of how these technologies can be abused as well as used. You can chat GPT or Grok or whatever it is. You can call up extraordinary amounts of information with just a few prompts. But by the same token, AI, the Terminator idea of the rise of the machines, which is also Pluto has gone into Aquarius, which is amplifying a lot of this, which is there for, I don't know, 14, 15 years. I forget the exact number. And then on top of that, we're coming up to the next Uranus return. Technically, it's exact in 2031, but it really begins this year when Uranus goes into tropical Gemini. So we're seeing this not just an advance of technology, but we've seen in the last 2 years with ChatGPT and AI video reconstructions would have blown anyone's mind 5 years ago. We take it for granted already, the things that we're able to do with these technologies. Um, Forgot where I was going with that. Let's see, ChatGPT. Oh, so with the Uranus return, it's also bringing us major developments in the UFO field with whistleblowers like David Grush coming out and Jake Barber and all this. And I also think it ties into what's happening with the telepathy tapes
Yeah.
controversy and the fact that Diane Powell, the research she's doing, which has been popularized through the podcast by Kai Dickens, that has huge potential, I think, if they can really shore up those results in ways that will convince the more skeptically minded, although I'm not sure they can ever be,
Mm.
really, to be honest. But there are these several converging developments taking place that I think all tie in to this Aquarian uh, tectonic shift. There's a true seismic shift taking place that is changing things. And I think it's also changing things in political ways. And I don't want to get into that too much here and get partisan, but I do want to say it is interesting how the tech bros are playing such an important role, whether it's Musk or Bezos or Zuckerberg, are playing an increasingly important role. These tech giants, and this is something that was foreshadowed in science fiction. It's whether you think it's a good or a bad thing, it's certainly Aquarian, you know.
Well, and many people talk about the danger of our moving more into technocracy.
Hmm.
And circling back to what you were just saying about AI and how it can be used to manipulate or control, can be weaponized, it expands our knowledge base, and the internet expands our interconnectedness with each other globally. But some of what you talk about and write about is the importance of Aquarius guiding us into cosmic mind
Yeah,
and into, and Bibhu Dev Misra in his book Yuga Shift talks about this as our movement into ascending consciousness in the Yuga cycle, that we have forgotten our capacities to be telepathic, to communicate, to access these other ways of knowing that are also the potential of the Aquarian age. So again, it seems like there are these two directions we can go: into the shadow side of the Aquarian age or the true potential of what we're capable of.
I do think on the one hand, the Aquarian age is signifying a quantum leap in intelligence. In like one of the other parts of it that I mentioned in Signs of the Times was as the third of the air signs, it relates to cosmic knowledge, like you just touched on. This idea of Aquarius is not about personal truths so much as universal truths, which is both good and bad. I mean, you need personal truth as well as universal truth. But so science is paramount in terms of understanding things. And I think that it's inevitable that we're going to make contact. We already have, but I won't go there. That we're going to make contact with non-human intelligences. It's happened in a very, kind of secretive way. It hasn't yet made
Mhm.
it into the mainstream, but I think it's inevitable that it will become uh, more mainstream, and that's quite a decentralization. It's like I've talked about the various levels of Copernicus decentralized the cosmos by saying the Earth was not the center. Darwin decentralized this. Einstein decentralized this. Hubble decentralized this, the galaxy, etc. And the next major decentralizations are probably going to be discovering we're not the only intelligent life form in the universe, but also that there may be other dimensions besides our own. And so this expansion of the mind, I think, will take the form of a broader horizon than we can now even conceive. So that, let's say, 500 to 1,000 years from now, the average person will have a different sense of what existence is about than we have now. But again, that's not necessarily good or bad. It all depends on what's done with it. Someone, again, I don't want to get partisan, but a person might have a very cosmic view of the universe and of life, but that doesn't mean they're going to be good about it. That doesn't
Mm.
mean they have an ethical core. So it's this ascension of consciousness has to bring with it, I think, the luggage from the Piscean age, so to speak. You can't just, it's like when you go from one age to the other, it's not just about banishing the previous lessons. The previous age, the good thing about the Piscean age, if I had to pick one thing, it was an awakening of soul, an
Yes.
awakening of conscience. I won't go into all the fine details of that, but that's something when you hear some of these tech bros talking about, you know, the problem with I forget what he said, about the problem with the modern age is too much empathy or something like that.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
the Aquarius energy taken so far that you forsake the empathy and the conscience that came with the Piscean age, so to speak. So that's my that's as far as partisans, and I'll get here for a second.
But what you're saying, I think, is so important, Ray, and some of what I talk about and have written about in my book is how we need to integrate the lessons of each age and clear the shadow aspects of each age. And, we're still, from my perspective, clearing some of the shadow aspects of the age of Aries, which became so
Yeah,
much about ego and power over and assertion of the self, competition. And that carried in over into the age of Pisces. And now we're clearing some of the shadow aspects of the age of Pisces also. But as you said, the gift of the age of Pisces, and I think its effort to correct some of those out of balance patterns in the age of Aries was to come back into that mystical understanding and that sense of who we are as a soul self, and to dissolve the ego, to move into that more awareness of our place in the cosmos and in the oneness and interconnectedness of all of life. So if we can bring that into the age of Aquarius, then it opens us. And you talk about how the age of Aquarius can then be the integration of spirituality and science, of left brain, right brain ways of knowing, of moving into other forms of consciousness.
yeah. When the Piscean age came in, it didn't get rid of the age of Aries. For example, the Piscean age is characterized in large part by Christianity, the rise of Christianity, the religion that has symbols of fishes, and crucifixion is a very Piscean sort of thing. The dissolving or the persecution of self, take your pick. And so you have onward Christian soldiers, which is definitely a blending of Pisces and Aries. And likewise, the age of Aquarius, if it can bring in that Piscean element, it becomes kind of an enlightened science, a spiritual science. And also, Aquarius, I think, is also very capitalistic. And I don't mean that as a good or a bad thing, but if it brings in the Piscean element, which is Pisces is very socialistic, very communistic, like Jesus and the disciples, sharing their goods and all this. I really think, and I hope I'm not getting partisan by saying this, but I really think you need a blend of that Aquarian capitalism and Piscean socialism so that you have safety nets for the poor. So it's not just all about monopolies and it's not just all about the rich getting richer. There's some compassion involved. So I think that blending of the two archetypes of the two ages is critical in a number of ways, very practically, economically, as well as, scientifically. Anyway, so that I think is important.
Speaking of that, Ray, how do you see and understand this upcoming conjunction of Neptune and Saturn? Neptune being the ruler of Pisces, Saturn, the traditional ruler of Aquarius. I mean, what is your sense of how that is trying to guide us in this next phase of the transition that we're in?
Um, the last time Saturn conjuncted Neptune was 1989, which was a major shift in society. What's interesting is that Neptune definitely relates to Pisces and the Piscean age, and that was really the death knell of communism in some respects, Saturn crossing Neptune. With the fall of the Soviet Union took place over several years, but basically 1989 was a critical turning point. That was also on my birthday in 1989, was when you had the kids in Tiananmen Square marching with
Mhm.
the Statue of Liberty mock-up, the Aquarian element trying to make inroads into like a Trojan horse into the communist regime, and didn't quite work out for them. But there was an interesting thing happening then in terms of the hard lessons of communism and capitalism, and now we're coming up to an era. It was the French astrologer Andre Barbeau who associated Saturn-Neptune alignments with the history of Russia and communism generally, going
Mm.
back centuries, and that he predicted that there was going to be a major, I don't remember if he said the fall of communism, but he talked about a major turning point for Russia in 1989. And now he's dead, but now people are predicting is there going to be something similar when Saturn, it's going to be getting close to a conjunction this year, especially in the summer when the two planets, Saturn and Neptune, station point in July. But they really come together next year. So we're talking about 2025, 2026. And so I think if Barbeau is right, and I think he was a brilliant astrologer, there's going to be some major shakeup in Russia that takes place. It may or may not tie into the Ukraine thing. It may or may not tie into the history of communism as an economic system. But in terms of individuals, getting away from the global context here for a second and bringing it back to people, it really depends to a certain extent on where it falls in your chart. So,
Mm.
for example, if someone has the Saturn Neptune conjunction in a hard aspect to their sun, they're probably going to be dealing with some dissolution of illusions uh,
Mm.
regarding their career or their ego or whatever. Well, that isn't necessarily bad. That actually could be a very good thing. I had a client years ago that he was incredibly egotistical and very proud of his wealth, and he basically went from being rich to being homeless. Best thing that could have ever happened to him. I mean, I'm saying that he would agree with that now too. By the way, I'm not just saying that judgmentally. And likewise, so when the Saturn Neptune hits, it's probably going to be a restructuring of your ideals and your dreams in various areas, depending on what house it falls in. Like if it's in the seventh house, it's probably going to be some major taking stock taking place in your marriage or your partnerships, maybe business partnerships. If it's in your second house, it might be financial. And it also depends on the natal aspects between those two planets. If you have a Saturn trine Neptune in your chart, that's going to be a totally different meaning than if you have a Saturn square Neptune in your birth chart. So you
Mhm.
can't do a one size fits all with things like this, but you can say that it's going to be some kind of having to take a good look at your dreams and your illusions. And the one thing I will also add is that Saturn is the discipline, it's work, it combined with the planet of dreams and spirituality and mysticism. So if a person knows how to work with that combination, it can be an incredible energy for going deeper into your spiritual practice. If you're an artist, it's an extraordinary time for bringing very ephemeral sort of ideas down into concrete form, whether that's music or painting or writing. Although it might be hard. I was born, as I said to you before we started talking, I was born with my moon sandwiched between Saturn and Neptune, which ain't no bargain when you're younger. When you're older, I think it's good if you're artist or whatever or spiritual, but when you're a kid, it's a nightmare. But it's very good for bringing things into concrete form. So if you're involved with any creative field, take advantage of these next 2 years, especially I would say July of this year, and I'm not sure when next year that's exact. I forgot the date on that or the periods when that's exact,
In
but in
February.
general, what's that?
In February.
In February. So, take advantage of it and be aware of the fact that it could be some delays. It's anything you do with Saturn tends to be a lot of hard work, but you look at the brilliant creatives through history, like Mozart was born, I think, under the opposition, and there's many, many examples of people that were able to take very subtle ideas. Joni Mitchell was born under Neptune conjuncting Venus square Saturn, and the song Clouds could not be a better
Mhm.
expression of Saturn Neptune. Could not possibly be better in terms of I've looked at clouds from both sides now. It's about
Yes.
illusions and it's about looking at love and the illusions, comparing love to clouds that can come and go and dissolve into nothingness. So it's absolutely fascinating to look at the charts of people born with those energies. And so anyway,
Well,
that's
and it's interesting that you studied filmmaking, you're a musician, you're a very gifted photographer. I've seen your photography, it's amazing. So you've really found that way to tap into the creativity and mysticism of Neptune and manifest it with Saturn. But what's your take on it being in Aries in terms of this collective shift that we're in? Do you see it as the potential for us to then dream new forms into being as we're
yeah, that's a good point.
transitioning into the Aquarian age?
I think that that's the optimal expression of it. That anything that goes into that 0 degrees or there thereabouts point of Aries, it's a new beginning, absolutely a new beginning. And it can be a time for regrouping in terms of your ideals and society. Here's the other thing about it, and this may be getting a little bit into the weeds, but there's a very important energy involved with that Saturn-Neptune conjunction, and that is what some people call a grand sextile. That which also happened around the time that Joni Mitchell was born
Mm,
in the of 1943, November 7th, where you had the outer planets involved in a trifecta of sorts. In this case, it's Pluto in Aquarius, trining Uranus and Gemini, and the two of those are sextiling Saturn, Neptune, and Aries. So for people that can work with that, it can be that amplifies the spiritual and the creative potentials of that combination. And so even in the midst of World War II, in 1943 or so, you had people like Joni Mitchell being born and George Harrison of the Beatles, and I think Mick Jagger. He might have been 42, I'm not sure. But it's not everybody responds, not everybody attunes to those highest potentials. But if you put your mind to it, you can really take advantage of it, especially if you know in advance when that's happening and what the nature of the energy is. So but back to your point, in terms of how this relates to the broader shift, I do think because of that grand sextile in particular, and the fact that Pluto's in Aquarius, and the fact that Uranus is involved, which are very Aquarian,
mhm.
symbols, I think that we're going to see in the midst of whatever chaos, whatever other chaos or messiness is happening in society, because I think there's quite a bit of that happening, and I don't think that's going to end right away, to put it mildly. I think that there is in the midst of that this creative ferment that is possible and that will be is already starting, I think. I think, in fact, I was writing on social media on Facebook this morning how I think that this Egyptian development, I think may very well be. It happened under the full moon eclipse last weekend, close to it, which was there was the Uranus and Taurus sextiling, Neptune, Saturn, and I think the Sun in Pisces.
Yes.
But in the broader sense, I think that this unfolding archaeological mystery, which may very well have legs, may tie into this incredible grand trine that's taking place this year. It comes to a head technically, well, you can't, when you're talking about so many planets, 4 planets, it's not like there's a single date when they all happen. They're all within a certain orb for a period of time. And I think that period of time is basically 2025, 2026. So we're in a difficult time, but we're also in a time of incredible possibilities for those that have ears to hear and for those that have the creative sensibility to tap into it.
It's beautifully said, Ray. And some of my sense often is that there's almost this kind of dimensional divide or two timelines playing out on the planet right now, with the timeline that is so much about the chaos and turbulence and the deconstruction of the paradigms of the past, or the intense last efforts of clinging to the paradigms of the past and power over and destruction. But then you have this timeline of heightened creativity and the possibility of moving rapidly into higher consciousness. And I love that you described that combination of the three outer transpersonal planets, because you write extensively about how they are the change makers. They are the planets that can guide us in our transformational process and into shifts in our consciousness. So it seems like they're trying to lead the way to support us in working this time more consciously, to move into new forms and new ideals and new ways of being.
You know, those outer planets are so important in terms of generational shifts and concerns, and even cosmic shifts and concerns. And in the last, 10,000 years, they've only come into a grand trine once, which was in the 6th century BC, which is sometimes referred to as the axial age, when all of these important shifts were happening in culture and major figures arising. And my friend Rick Tarnas has written about this
Mm,
in his book, Cosmos and Psyche. I think he also wrote about that in Passion of the Western Mind. And we're not going to see another one of those grand trine of the outer planets um, in our life. Oh, excuse me, that was the conjunction. Forgive me. The conjunction of those 3 planets occurred, but there was a grand trine in 1769 and 1770, which
mm,
is when Beethoven was born, Napoleon was born, Alexander von Humboldt was born, maybe Coleridge, I'm not sure. So it's part of the reason I call these shifts, these periods, stargates, when it's like there's an
mm,
opening when things come through. And or like in the 1960s, you had Uranus conjuncting Pluto, and in 65 and 66, which was those though the Beatles and Dylan were channeling incredible things and just putting these things into form like they were picking low-hanging fruit creatively. So bringing this back around to what we're talking about, even though we're not going to see anything quite like either the triple conjunction of the 6th century BC or the grand trine, or the grand trine of 1769 to 1770, we do have the opportunity to see some of these grand sextiles, which aren't quite as powerful, like the one in 1943 and the one that's coming up this year and next, where those outer 3 planets are at least in touch in a trine sextile formation. So again, this is an exciting time potentially. It's we have to look for the best we can in difficult times like this, and I'd say that's probably the best thing to zero in on.
Well, and just to follow up on the sextiles, that's an aspect, unlike the trine, the sextiles, we have to work more consciously. and really integrate those energies. And then it can be a very creative, powerful, transformational combination.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you've talked about, I think, in When the Stars Align, is how also part of, as we move into the Aquarian age, it is more and more this understanding of our interconnectedness, our being a part of this larger global community. But you also stress the importance of personal responsibility and self-awareness as we're moving into these new paradigms to be influencing how they'll manifest.
Yeah, it always comes back down to, I think, the individual as far as being aware of, well, I mean, it works on several levels, but the whole personal responsibility side of it, it's there are those people that I think will just expect these trines and sextiles to kind of manifest without having to do much to kind of make
Mm.
it happen. And yet, like you said, with sextiles and to a certain extent with trines, uh, it can be lazy. I have a bunch of trines in my natal chart, and I'm always having to guard against, just being lazy. And thank God there's some squares and conjunctions in there to fire me up. But the sextiles and the trines, it's not guaranteed that you're going to
Mm.
do anything with it. That's why the timing is so important. That's why astrology is so important, that you know when these things are happening, you can take advantage of it. One of the advantages for me of astrology in my life has been that I can see, like when I wrote the Signs of the Times, which is about the age shift. It was at a time when Uranus was trining my Gemini planets. Uranus was in Aquarius. I worked on it before. I started it long before then, but I really finished it up when Uranus was all in these trines to my Gemini planets. The point is that if I didn't know that was coming up, I would not have taken advantage of it. And as it turned out, the ideas were just flowing. It was
Mm.
still a lot of work. I had to do it was really one of the worst times of my life in terms of having the editor of the publishing house say you got to rewrite essentially the whole book, which was pretty traumatic. Because here I thought I'd already gotten the advance money and I more or less put it towards, necessities. And they said, you got to rewrite everything. It's
Mm.
the style isn't quite right. But the point is that with the trines, I was able to take advantage of them, and I wouldn't have known about it if I didn't know astrology. So I tend to time things. You don't want to get too tied into astrology. That can be, dysfunctional too. But to me, one of the great advantages of it is you can avoid the really tough energies or redirect them in ways that are more constructive. And you could take advantage of the windows that open up like that, those stargates, and go to town with it and come up with some extraordinary things if put your mind to it.
Mm. That's great, Ray. Well, there's so much more I'd like to talk with you about, and maybe we can continue this in a future conversation. But I think part of what you're saying now that is so important is astrology can be such a profound guide to us in tuning in consciously to the energies that are coming to us, that it's not predictive or deterministic, but we can work with awareness with these planetary energies to allow them to guide us through a process of change and transformation. And this is such a profound time when we can move into higher consciousness if we work with these energies.
I will add one more thing to that, and that is that, and I think this is especially important now. When you see the difficult energies coming up, like the United States is going through its Pluto return, it's actually going through three returns right now.
The Chiron
Pluto
return,
return,
hopefully.
Chiron return, and Uranus return, all within a 10-year span of time. That's very turbulent. And especially the Pluto return, which, if you look at the Pluto returns in nations like England and the Roman Empire, England's been through three of them. The Roman Empire went through two of them. It's a very troubling energy in terms of dredging up a lot of resentments and acrimony, like, for example, the Protestant Catholic divide in the English history, for example, the fighting and the killing and all this. And when you see things like what's happening now in the US, it's very easy to get sucked into this polarized, reactive mind space and to get worked up. And maybe you can feel this, righteous justification of, well, I have a right to be. Well, you don't have to get worked, you don't have to get upset to make a difference. So whatever your political view is, whether you're, pro this or anti that, you can make a difference without having to get really upset and hate people and all this. And so knowing that this Pluto return has been happening, just to use that one energy, not even talking about the Chiron or the Uranus, I've really tried my hardest. I haven't always succeeded. Like last night, as I was telling you before we spoke, I get worked up over a relative that has a different political viewpoint from myself. But I can always stand back at some point and say, that Pluto, I'm not going to let it suck me in. I'm not going to, I can see what's right or wrong, at least what I think is right or wrong in the situation, and I can take action to kind of rectify it. But that doesn't mean I have to dispense with my awareness and my clarity and my emotional centeredness about it. So I think that's really important, and that's where another thing that astrology can be good at, because you see, for example, one of my teachers, early astrology teachers, Goswami Kriyananda, he made some comment once. He said, if you're talking to someone that doesn't believe in astrology and they think it's hogwash, just tell them when Mars is going to square their moon. Because even someone that is relatively spiritually centered is going to be challenged, because when Mars comes up to square your moon, there's going to be a 48-hour period there when someone's going to push your buttons. And even if you try like I have, every time it comes around, he says, I'm not going to be affected by it because I know it's coming up. And someone will say something. Usually it's online and usually it's political. Or it might be I'll be in line at the post office and someone steps on my toe and they're being very inconsiderate. And it's like, you get that immediate kind of response, that Mars response. It's Mars square moon is one of the classic triggers for being emotional and being angry. And it gets the best of us and, certainly the worst of us. And that's, again, where astrology can give you some sense of when these things are coming up, and you can be on your guard a little bit better.
Or conscious with how you navigate those energies,
Yeah.
because circling back to the Pluto return, in the second house of the US chart, it can be a time of transformation and redefining our values as a nation
And our economy.
and our economy. So there's always the spectrum of how things can manifest. And I think that's part of the gift of astrology in helping us be aware of the energies that are at work so that we can work them at their highest conscious level.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for this conversation, Ray, and I do hope we can do this again and dive deeper into some of your writing about how astrology can also guide us individually in our personal healing and transformation and movement into new cosmologies and consciousness. So I'd love to get into that conversation with
That'd
you.
be great.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And thank you to this community that is working this time in such a conscious way. Blessings and love to all of you.
Thank you.